Okay, going to be reading from The Day We Met the Queen. This is chapter 6 called The Lord of Chambers and Lions. Sometimes the quietest people can surprise you, especially when they get angry. I knew that because I had seen Armut fight bullies when he had never even spoken 2 words in English, and I had seen Mum on the bus when she never usually yells and instead tries to bite her tongue. I can't bite my tongue because it hurts too much, so I always say what I think most times. So did Tom and Josie. But Michael never says anything when he gets angry or upset. He goes quiet and looks as if he's thinking a deep thought or waiting for someone else to speak up for him. So standing there in front of MP Fry, who was still holding on to Armut's bag, nobody expected Michael to say the things he said. In fact, I don't think even Michael expected it because his face looked so surprised and confused afterwards. This is what Michael shouted. "You give Armut his bag back or I'm going to fight you and sue you, and my mum will take you to court for being a bag snatcher who snatches bags from refugee children. So give it back now or else." When he had finished, I could feel Michael shaking next to me, and I heard Tom whispering, "Whoa." Then, from somewhere in the crowd on the other side of the road, a man shouted, "Yeah, you go, my lad." And a woman cried, "Shame on you, Fry! Shame on you, Fry!" And within a few seconds, lots of people were shouting out the exact same thing as the woman. I looked across the road to where they were all standing and saw the nicer signs that I had seen on the news that morning. I realised that we had been trying to push through the horrible crowds to get to the Queen's Palace when we should have gone through the opposite side. That was when I saw Uncle Lenny and Officer Jensen and Officer Wu pushing their way through the crowd towards us, looking red and sweaty and hot. Officer Wu was shouting something into the large walkie-talkie on his shoulder that sounded like, back up, centre point 312. "Are you all okay?" panted Uncle Lenny, quickly checking our faces with his eyes. I didn't answer because MP Fry had grabbed Armut's bag and was raising it up in the air. It was clear he wanted to say something. Uncle Lenny stood behind us with his hands on mine and Armut's shoulders. It felt as if he was our bodyguard, and if nothing in the world would ever hurt us. The crowd slowly became quiet as the police officers and the cameras and reporters pushed closer, making MP Fry's smile wider. I didn't like seeing Armut's red rucksack in MP Fry's hands because I knew how important it was to Armut and how badly he wanted to show it to the Queen. But I made myself stay still and wait because I knew I was too short to reach it. As MP Fry began to speak, half of the crowd began to boo and hiss, while the other half cried out, "Darn right!" There was a pounding in my ears, just like a drum beating, so I couldn't hear any of his words except "Queen and country" and "duty." All around us, the crowds seemed to be getting bigger and taller, so I held on tighter to Armut's arm. I could tell he was getting angry because he was beginning to stand more stiffly, and his hands were curling up into fists, just like they had done when he had roared at Brendan the bully in the playground once. But I knew we were safe because now a lot of other police officers had joined Officer Jensen and Officer Wu, and all of them were busy trying to make the crowd stay back and not squash us. I looked up at Mr. Irons and saw he was still smiling at us, as if seeing Armut upset made him happy. MP Fry was smiling too, so much that it was as if his teeth had taken over most of his face. He was waving at the people behind us and looking at the news cameras. Then, suddenly, he raised his hands a second time. The booing and hissing and cheering instantly became quiet again as he took a step back and cried out, "But don't just take my word for it. Mr. Irons has first-hand experience of just how dangerous allowing refugees into our country and our schools can be." I felt my mouth fall open as Mr. Irons stepped proudly forward and took Armut's bag in his hands. I could hear Armut growling like an angry lion and felt Josie taking a step forwards as if she wanted to kick Mr. Irons in the leg just as hard as she could. Everyone around us was now looking at Mr. Irons, waiting to hear what he was going to say. Mr. Irons puffed up his chest and, stroking his moustache, looked at the cameras. He had just opened his mouth when suddenly, screech! Everyone jumped and turned as the largest two gates of the palace began to slowly squeak open. A hush fell over the crowd as all the cameras and reporters and crowds turned away from Mr. Irons towards the gates to see what was happening. After a few seconds, the gates clanged to a stop, and two of the Queen's special guards, with their large pointy swords and giant black hats, marched from the huts at the front of the palace right up to the corner of each gate and gave a salute. As soon as their fingers had touched their hats, two police officers on motorcycles appeared from the back of the palace, followed by a large black shiny car with two flags fluttering on the front bonnet. The flags were golden yellow and red and blue, and showed dancing lions and a harp. Almost immediately, whispers and shouts began to fill the air. "It's the Queen! It's her butler! It's the royal baby! Quick, take as many photos as you can! Make sure you're rolling!" The police officers in yellow jackets began to wave the crowds back against the walls so that the car could come through the palace gates and out onto the road. Even MP Fry and Mr. Irons were forced to move to the other side to the Queen's large water fountain. I looked at the car and at its dark windows and wondered if the Queen had become so angry with us for missing tea and making people argue outside her house that we had made her leave the country. I wished I could have made her understand that it wasn't our fault and that we had tried our best to get to her on time. We watched as the car slowly rolled out of the gates and headed towards the fountain, but instead of passing it by and continuing up the red road, it stopped right in front of us. Armut grabbed my elbow and I grabbed Michael's as a door swung open. Everyone gasped as we waited to see who it was, hoping it would be the Queen. But it wasn't. It was a man. A very tall, tanned man with brown and white hair, dressed in a black suit and wearing the largest golden necklace I had ever seen anyone wear in real life. He looked like he could be a mayor, but I knew the mayor of London was a woman called Padgie Mujic, and I had seen what she looked like in the newspapers, so I knew it wasn't her. Looking down at me and Armut and Tom and Josie and Michael, and bowing his head at Uncle Lenny, the man smiled and said, "I hear you are running slightly late for your scheduled meeting with the Queen?" Josie nodded and opened her mouth, but instead of saying yes, she gave a hiccup so loud it seemed to echo across all of London. It made her turn so red even her freckles seemed to disappear. "Let me introduce myself. I am the Lord Chamberlain and—" "Whoa, you mean you're the man who sent us our invitations?" interrupted Tom. The Lord Chamberlain smiled again. "And you must be Tom." Tom cried out, "Whoa!" again and looked at me. He poked Michael on the arm as if Michael might not have heard and whispered, "He knows my name." "And you must be Josie and Michael and Armut." Holding out his hands to each of them in turn, he shook theirs. Then he turned to me and introduced himself to me and Uncle Lenny too, and gave us a handshake that was as warm and as soft as a slice of freshly baked bread. "As the Lord Chamberlain, I am responsible for overseeing all of Her Majesty's ceremonial duties, which includes looking after the very special guests' permitted entrance onto her grounds and chambers. The Queen has taken note of the cause of your delay and has sent me to fetch you. If you would kindly permit me to do so." "You mean we get to go in your car?" asked Michael, so excited that he was pushing up his glasses, even though they didn't have anywhere left to go. The Lord Chamberlain smiled and, stepping back behind the door, waited for us all to climb in. "We are going to meet the Queen, yes?" asked Armut, squeezing my elbow even harder. I was too excited for words to come out, so instead I nodded as fast as I could. "Good," said Armut, as he turned around and took 3 steps up to Mr. Irons. Putting his hands on his hips, he shouted, "You give bag back to me! The Queen, she needs to see it. It is come all the way from Syria and is gift from my dad. With his face crumpled like a sulking baby's, Mr. Irons slowly reached out and gave Armit his red rucksack back. His nose began to whistle loudly and angrily, like a very far-away train, and some people behind him began to mutter and whisper. But as soon as Armit had his bag back in his hands, a deafening cheer rippled through the crowd. I waited for the boos and hisses too, but there were none. The Lord Chamberlain had made them go silent. Then, just as we were about to climb in the car, the Lord Chamberlain turned to MP Fry and, in a voice that was different and stricter to the one he had used for us, he said, "Her Majesty wishes to convey a message to you, sir." MP Fry stood up straight and held his nose high in the air, almost as high as Mr. Irons. "Yes?" he asked. The Lord Chamberlain continued, his voice very loud and clear. "Her Majesty wishes to thank you for your concern regarding her position as the head of state, but she would like me to remind you that she has been in this honoured position for longer than you have been alive, and, as the longest reigning monarch in history, she would also like to remind you of the depth and breadth of her knowledge as regards her duties and limitations." MP Fry looked as if he didn't know what to say, and behind him reporters and cameramen and lots of people in the crowd giggled and whispered, and then, as if his teeth were trying to stop his words from coming out, he replied, "Please thank Her Majesty for her kind reminder." The Lord Chamberlain smiled and, after making sure we were all seated safely in the car, calmly walked around to the front seat to sit next to the driver. "I think MP Fry just got told," whispered Tom, as the large black car turned smoothly back towards the palace, and another cheer rang through the air around us. I grinned and felt Uncle Lenny give my hand a squeeze, as the flags with the golden lions and the lord who looked after them led us towards all the Queen's grounds and chambers.